Hello, my name is Maria Gillen, also known as Story Seeds in the story world. I love co-creating stories with people. I love pulling the red thread of imagination and of memory from my audience and then weaving new stories from that. We find that they're often full of great wisdom. On the 26th of May 2022, I collaborated with the Irish Forestry School. We had a beautiful day in a forest in Northern Ireland, and at the end of the day, we sat at the edge of the forest, and this beautiful story coalesced from the red threads of story. Once upon a time, and maybe this is that time, at the edge of a beautiful forest, there lived a woman called Sheila, Sheila of the old ways. This forest was simply known as the unknown forest, for it was a little bit dubious of having connection with human beings. It made an exception for the Bean Feasa of Ireland, the wise women of Ireland, and this included Sheila, who was a Bean Feasa, a wise woman. Sheila would go into the forest every day with an empty bowl, and the forest would show her its bounty, its riches, and it would invite her to partake. She might find some mushrooms, or maybe a little bit of barley, or wild garlic to flavour things. So many herbs to choose from. And she would take these and put them in her basket and walk back to her little cottage. She'd be putting the water on to boil and adding a little bit of this and a little bit of that to that water when there'd be a knock on the door, and Sheila would open the door, and who was ever there, well, they needed exactly what she had just put into her pot to boil. And Sheila would smile to herself and she'd say, "Isn't Mother Nature wonderful?" Sometimes people would come and they'd say, "Oh, my joints and my bones are swollen, Sheila. Can you help me?" And sometimes she'd massage her own heat into those hands and they would become young and supple again. And sometimes they'd say, "Oh, Sheila, Sheila, I need something bigger than that." And she might give them a little bit of licorice or a little bit of lavender in one of her teas, and they would find that they could move their hands and their fingers again. Or somebody might say, "Sheila, Sheila, I have such a busy mind today. I can't sleep. I keep making lists." Did you ever have a busy brain that you just needed to let it rest? And Sheila would say, "Come on in, take a seat by my fire." And she'd give them a blanket that she'd crocheted herself, that smelt of grandmother's apple tarts with clove and some unknown scent. And then she'd give you a cup to hold in that blanket, and you would sip the tea with lavender and nettle, and she might sing a song, "Shaheen Shah, oh lo lo, Shaheen Shah Makri." And before she was even at the end of the first line, you would drift off into a beautiful sleep. And when you'd wake up, you'd say, "Sheila, Sheila, did you let me sleep?" And she'd say, "Isn't that the very reason you came to me? To have a good sleep?" And she'd be giving you a package of tea and sending you on your way. Sheila also knew how to listen to the forests, to the songs of the birds, and the wisdoms they were telling you, to the sigh of the breeze, to the sound of the creatures moving in different patterns in the undergrowths and the hedges. And she knew how to listen to the grandmother tree. One night she woke in the middle of the night. This night even the moon was on her holidays. It was so dark you could barely see your hand in front of your face. But when Sheila heard the call of Shanwaher in her sleep, of the grandmother in her sleep, well then she got up and she opened her door, and her feet and the soles of her feet brought her safely through the forest to the roots of the grandmother tree. Do you know what the grandmother tree is? It's that tree that when she was a sapling threw her seeds out all around her, and her babies grew, and it became a young forest. And over time they called in their partners, and it became a more mature forest as other species joined them. And so it went, and so it went, and all the time Grandmother Tree was in the middle of the forest, keeping her eye on all of her babies and grandbabies and great-grandbabies and great-great-grandbabies, and so it went. But this night, she had a bad feeling. And as Sheila sat between the two green ancient roots of the grandmother tree and laid her head upon the tree and began to sleep, she could hear in her dreams that grandmother was saying, "The farmers are fighting, the farmers are fighting, and I'm afraid for my babies. Sheila, help us." And as Sheila came up through the layers of sleep, she thought to herself, how am I going to help? And when she was finally awake, she did what she always did when she had a question. She looked around the forest. It was a grey November winter's day. The ground was mucky. The last of the stubborn leaves were hanging by a thread on the trees, and the vast majority of them covered the forest floor. She looked around, and on the ground she saw a beautiful long white feather, and it seemed to her to be a little of nature's miracles that had been untouched by the weather and untouched by the muck that surrounded it. She picked up that feather, and because she couldn't stop herself, she pulled her fingers through it. Every colour of the world began to peep through the fronds of that feather, and some colours that have not been imagined yet. And as this happened, she could feel her shoulders move behind. She could feel her arms begin to take their place behind her back, and she developed beautiful, strong, beating wings, pristine white, as she became a swan. And she began to fly high, high up above the forest. And when she looked down, she could see those trees leaning into one another, whispering love things to one another, but never taking one another's space. When she got to the edge of the forest, she could see them there. The fighting farmers, with their red faces screwed up with rage, shouting and gesticulating, throwing their tools to the ground and pointing at the edge of the forest as if that was their next domain. And the heaviness of it pushed Sheila down, down, down through the forest until she came once more to the comforting roots of the grandmother tree. How am I going to help? She said. What am I going to do? And then, like the Dree of old, like the old druids, she began to call to the elements. No snuguiha, she called. Tarkuim, Tarkuim, come to me, come to me. Kauriuklum, help me. She called, and the ways of the wind and the breeze began to sigh through the trees. Call the people of the teas. Call the people of the teas. Of course, she said, of course I'll call those people. And she sat once more between the two beautiful limbs of Shanwater, her old and ancient roots. And she said, people of the tea, if you can hear me, if you agree, if you are free, come to me, Tarquim, come to me. And they did. First one woman came in saying, Sheila, I had this mad dream and I thought I'd come and see you. And she was soon joined by another and another until there was a fine crowd in a semicircle all the way around Sheila. And she told them the story and she said, I need your help. Find a feather. Some people put their hands out and a feather floated down and into the palms of their hand. For that is how life is for some people. Other people, they began to dig near the roots of the tree in the muck, and they pulled feathers from the ground and they cleaned them down. Other people, they found feathers in the old hedges or in ancient nests. And when every one of them had a feather, they came back together and they said, isn't this amazing? I have the same feather as you, and you, and you. Look at that. We all have the same feather. And Sheila smiled and said to herself, isn't Mother Nature wonderful? And then she instructed them to pull their fingers through the feathers. And as they did, they could feel the change of their hands going behind their back. They could feel the connection to the one in front, to the one behind, to the one on the right, to the one on the left. For they had become a great formation of starlings. And now, as if they had agreed it, they began to rise up as one entity through the branches of the trees, up out over the forest, and they began to move towards where the farmers were still fighting. They became between the sun and the fighting farmers, and the farmers looked up to see what was the shadow in the sky, and as they did, it took on the form of a great big shadowy heart. And then, at precisely the same second, as if they'd agreed it, every one of those birds beat their wings and the heart became a living, beating, shadowy heart right there in the sky. And the farmers smiled. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you smile for something like that? And when they looked down, they were still smiling, still shaking their heads at the miracle of it. And they put down their tools and they continued to smile at one another, and they made an agreement to go home because they knew that they had enough.